one of the points that you make is that improvement, we should think about it as a muscle to get trained, both in identifying the areas that need improvement that we were talking about, either systems or processes, but also in the actual effort of improvement. When I think about building a muscle, I'm not going to start by bench pressing 500 pounds, right? I'm not going to start with the organizational overhaul. I'm going to start with maybe a pair of light dumbbells, right? And so, how can you help us think about, these huge improvement efforts within the context of a system and how to get there by building the small improvement muscle?
Yeah. Well, one thing to think about in organizations, leaders, when they're uncomfortable with
Hmm.
the current performance of something, often look to change to get a different result,
Yeah.
right? So there's two challenges that you can run into, right? One is that you assume that the way things are working are just fine, and my attention should go on just sort of pushing harder on people, or maybe using
Sure.
incentives, or maybe it's an educational problem, So there, I make an assumption that the system I have actually is good enough, and there's something else that's wrong. There's some misalignment, and that's
Is
really
that ever the
common.
case?
Actually, a lot of times the system that you have, it's perfectly designed to get the results that you get, right? So
Right,
that's an
right.
old saying that's been used around healthcare for a long time, popularized by Paul Batalden at Dartmouth, that actually came from a book. But it's true. Any system that you look at is built to get the results that it gets. And one of the first questions, like we were talking about before, is, do I have something that is stable and predictable, or do I not? And that should be the first question that anybody should ask is, because if I have a system that is predictable, like I don't like the results, but if I don't do anything, I know it'll be this way next month or next
Yeah.
week, then that's useful, because that helps me know that if I want a different result, I've got to change the way we work in some fashion, right? If it's unpredictable, if the data, every time I look at it is going in different directions or has weird patterns, or I can't make a guess as to what's going to happen next time, then I got to figure out how to get it stable. And often that means we've got to go back to the fundamentals. We've got to figure out, like, how do we create a shared way in which we work together on a particular process? And it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be similar. The way I often describe it is, it's like cruise control in your car. If you ever want to, if you drive, I don't know if you use cruise control, but this is a great way to learn about variation, is to get on the highway, not necessarily in rush hour, go in a time where traffic's moving somewhat, and put yourself in the fast lane, and then set your car for a set speed. Do something like, so let's say it's, 65 miles an hour, maybe go 68 and set your cruise control there. And then watch what happens. And it's rather fascinating. If you've ever done a road trip like this, you've probably had this experience. But all of a sudden, you'll see that cars will pass you. And then if you do nothing, in a minute or two, they'll start falling back and you'll pass them. And then without you, you're a constant. You've established yourself as a constant, but all of a sudden you'll watch people pass you, and then you'll pass them, and there'll be all this, or somebody will whip by you, and then 5 minutes later you'll pass them. And what ends up happening is, by creating yourself as a stable constant, you're now able to see all the variation around you. Whereas when you were driving like everybody else, you were constantly adjusting your speed in relation to the other cars. So you didn't notice all the variation that existed. But when you stabilized yourself, when you said, we're going to, you basically create standard work or follow a standard process, that enabled you to see all the noise that wasn't obvious to you before, because you became constant. So in the case of process improvement, that's one of the first things I always ask is, what's your process? And if you have one, let's try to use it. There's a good chance you're
Sure.
not using it. So it's really actually
Right.
interesting to try your process as it's written and see what happens. And that actually stabilizes work. It takes away some of the noise, and you'll almost instantly identify that there are things that need to be changed, right? And then if the system that you have and the process that you have is not working where you want it, then that's a great place to start thinking about, how do I change the system I have to get to a different result?